Opposite action is basically DBT's way of saying, I know your brain wants to do that, but hear me out. What if we did the opposite? Which, when you think about it honestly, is pretty rude, but effective. Welcome back to Friendless, sweet peas. I'm your host, James Avramenko, and this is episode 6, Emotional Regulation Part 2. Last episode, we did the understanding work, what emotions actually are, what they do, how to name them accurately, how to check whether your emotion is responding to facts or to a story. This episode, we're going to do a little bit of a pivot. What we're going to be talking about is what to do when your emotions are real, genuinely, legitimately real, but acting on them would end up making things worse. Because this is a situation that I know I have found myself in a lot. I know a lot of people have found themselves in a lot, where you're not misreading the situation. The feeling is totally justified. But the thing that the feeling wants to do is going to end up doing damage to something that you care about. Maybe it's going to just not solve anything. It's just that there's this sort of justified gut reaction to it. And that is where opposite action comes in. We're also going to cover 2 kind of supporting skills. We're looking at problem solving, which people jump to far too quickly. But this is for when, the emotion is justified and there is something that you actually can do about this situation. And then on the other side, we're going to be looking at building positive experiences, which is a preventative skill. It's not about crisis management. It's about building these sort of emotional reserves. So every emotion comes with an action urge. We talked about this a little bit in the last episode, but it's this idea of there's sort of a verb to every emotion. Generally speaking, fear makes you want to move away, right? It makes you want to run. Anger wants you to move forward. It wants you to fight. Sadness wants you to move away. It wants you to withdraw. Shame, move away as well. Makes you want to hide, right? And sometimes those urges totally make sense. Fear of a real threat. Running probably is a good idea. If anger pops up, there's anger you're feeling at a genuine violation, then setting a limit is appropriate. Sadness after a loss, withdrawing to grieve is healthy, right? But sometimes those exact same urges, responding to those exact same emotions, end up making things dramatically worse. Fear of social rejection makes you avoid social situations. The avoidance ends up keeping you isolated. And then the isolation feeds the fear. And now the fear is so much bigger than when you started. Shame about, struggling with something, it makes you hide. The hiding keeps you from getting support. The lack of support means you keep struggling alone. And now that shame is even heavier. Loneliness, loneliness makes you pull away. Pulling away makes you more lonely. And now you're more entrenched than you ever were before. This is that cycle. The emotion has an urge. The urge makes the emotion worse, which makes the urge stronger, which makes things worse. Right? And it just builds and builds and builds. Opposite action is a tool that is implemented to interrupt that cycle. I'll share an experience I had where I tried to sort of apply this. Not to sound like a broken record, but throughout this medical leave that I've been on, that is wrapping up very soon, I've gone through periods of feeling just massively lonely. Look, I'm a theater major, so I'm going to be a little dramatic here. It's that loneliness that you feel, that just heavy, your chest is tight, you're lost under that weight. You've kind of convinced yourself that, nobody cares and there's nothing that you can do about it, right? And when I'm in those kind of deep pressure moments, my instinct and the very first thing my brain always suggests is isolate, pull away, cancel plans, don't reach out, assume everybody's busy or doesn't want to hear from you. Just, stay home, stay quiet, don't be a burden, which is, classic loneliness logic. And if I continued to follow that urge, I would end up making that loneliness even worse. Objectively, measurably worse, right? Because isolation feeds loneliness. When you're lonely and you pull away from people, you're not protecting yourself. You're reinforcing the exact belief that's making you lonely in the first place. The idea of, nobody wants me around. Every time you cancel plans because you assume people don't really want you there, you're teaching your brain that the loneliness is justified, that you are right to be alone. And so in that moment, the opposite action, something that I continue to work on and try to do myself, but throughout the last few months, what I've done is you reach out, right? That's the opposite. If the urge is withdrawal, you lean in, right? So for me, it's reach out, say yes to plans, initiate connection, even if it felt vulnerable, even if it felt scary, even though it felt like I might be bothering people, even though that sort of loneliness is like screaming, nobody wants to do this, nobody wants to hear from you. Do it anyway, right? Now, did I do this opposite action? Sometimes. Sometimes I reached out. Sometimes if somebody invited me out, sometimes I said yes, even when I really, really didn't want to. Sometimes I was the one to initiate texting friends with plans, and then sometimes I still isolated. Sometimes the emotional urge still won. Sometimes I canceled. Sometimes I stayed home and I totally spiraled. And it kind of has to be okay, right? Because the thing to remember with all these skills, but with the one we're talking about right now, opposite action is really hard when the emotion is loud. When loneliness or whatever it is you're feeling is at a 9, doing the opposite of what it's telling you to do can sometimes feel like just walking directly into the fire, right? But I did notice that the times that I acted opposite, the times I reached out, the times I, whatever, that initial emotional urge of loneliness or sadness or whatever it was, it diminished. Didn't disappear, but it got smaller and just that much more manageable, right? And again, broken record moment, that's the point. It's not to make these emotions disappear. It's not to never have these thoughts again. It's just to work with them in a more manageable perspective and size. And that really is just the core insight of opposite action. Sometimes emotions are really reliable guides, and sometimes they are leading you directly into the thing that you are actually most afraid of. And, fear avoids, right? Avoidance makes fear grow. Shame hides, and hiding makes shame heavier. Loneliness withdraws, right? And withdraw makes loneliness worse. So you got to remember, like we said, emotions are innocuous, right? The emotion isn't doing a bad job. The emotion itself is doing its job as it's supposed to. The action urge makes complete sense given what the emotion is, has been hired to do, right? But following it faithfully every time without questioning, well, I think we know what happens when people just blindly follow orders, right? So, opposite action is intended as the interruption. If it's safe, do the opposite and just sort of see what happens. So how does that actually work? First, and I think this is important to sort of lay the foundation, opposite action is not a tool you use every time you have a difficult emotion. That's, emotional bypassing. That would be essentially suppression with an extra step. So it's not every single time. It comes with 2 really specific contextual conditions. One being the emotion doesn't fit the facts. So you've checked the facts, like we talked about. You've realized that your emotion is responding to a story, not to what's actually happening. You are terrified of this social event, but there's no actual threat, right? You've convinced yourself something's wrong in a relationship, but there's no evidence of that. You're overwhelmed by a task, but when you break it down, it becomes manageable. The emotion is real, but it doesn't fit the actual facts, which means following its action urge isn't going to serve you. The second condition is when acting on the emotion won't help your goals. So even if the emotion is justified, the anger is real, the hurt's real, the situation is genuinely bad, acting on the action urge is going to damage something you care about. So you're furious at a friend who said something really hurtful. And, the anger fits, but yelling at them is going to damage the friendship, and you want that connection. So the anger is justified, but the action urge isn't serving your goals. So you're going to use opposite action when one of these conditions is true. If your emotions fit the facts and the action urge serves your goals, that's, just a justified emotion with an appropriate response. No need to do the opposite, right? Okay. So you only use opposite action when one of these conditions is true. If your emotion fits the facts and the action urge serves your goals, that's just a justified emotion with an appropriate response. No need to do the opposite. So when you've decided opposite action is the right call, how do you actually use it? Step one is identify the emotion. What are you actually feeling specifically? We talked about naming, right? So don't just say I feel bad, but name it. I'm angry, I'm upset about whatever, right? Next is identify the action urge. What does the emotion want you to do, right? So I'm feeling fearful of this event, so I'm feeling like I should avoid it. I'm feeling angry at this person. I feel like I should attack or snap or lash out, whatever. I'm feeling shameful of this thing I said, so I want to hide. I want to disappear. I want to stop showing up. Sadness is making withdrawal. It makes me want to stay in bed, stop engaging, right? What is the actual urge? What is the verb behind the emotion that you're feeling? Step 3 is do the opposite completely. And this is one that can be surprisingly easy to screw up because you can't half-ass opposite action. If you're doing, let's say if you're doing opposite action to sort of counter shame emotions and you reach out to somebody, but you do it in this like really apologetically, self-deprecatingly, leading with how you probably shouldn't be bothering them. Like that's not opposite action. That's still hiding. You're just kind of adding extra layers of work for yourself. Opposite action is showing up without apology. Reach out without already undermining yourself. Just, it's about letting yourself be seen without immediately kind of preempting the rejection, right? Just full commitment. Basically acting like the emotions weren't there. It's not suppressing them. It's not pretending you don't feel them, but it's not letting them take the steering wheel, right? So let's I thought I would give a few examples of a few different emotions so you can kind of see how it sort of shifts, right? So let's say you're feeling afraid. You're feeling fear for a sort of a specific social anxiety, right? So the emotion here is, fear of rejection or judgment at a social event. The action urge is maybe going to be cancel, stay home, avoid the thing, right? So the opposite action is going to be go to the party, even if it's just for 10 minutes. You engage with somebody at the party and you commit to that engagement. You don't go in a sort of a defensive crouch. You don't stand in the corner just, counting the seconds till it's over. But you actually show up and you engage and you make yourself be a part of the party. Avoidance is going to teach your brain that this threat is real. And so every time you cancel because of this social anxiety, your brain is going, oh, totally great call, because that was actually totally dangerous. And it's so smart for us to avoid this. And we should totally avoid this again in the future. And then that anxiety grows to the point where it's now 10 times harder to show up at a simple gathering than it used to be, right? But if you show up and then you see that you survived it, you're teaching your brain that that threat is manageable. And, obviously the anxiety doesn't disappear overnight, but each time you do this, it gets smaller. Something like anger, right? So if the emotion here is, let's call it real justified anger at someone that you care about, right? And so that action urge is you want to be really sharp. You want to yell at them. You want to send them a message, in full caps, right? And just like really lay into them. The opposite action is lean into a calm tone. Get curious about their perspective. Validate their side before stating yours. Maybe ask a question instead of making an accusation. Now, this doesn't mean suppress your anger. It doesn't mean pretend it's fine. It means you are choosing not to weaponize it in the moment. You address the issue, but you address it in a way that keeps the relationship intact. Sadness, right? So the emotion here, we're talking like a real heavy sadness, the kind that kind of makes your bed feel like it's kind of the only option. Something's happened, it's pulling you down. The action urge here is to cancel, to withdraw, to stop engaging with the world. This can be contextual. Obviously, it's not like, oh, your mother died yesterday, better opposite action, because that's one of those, the emotion matches the story. But if you're wanting to get moving, the opposite action from there is to get up, do one small activating thing, move your body, even if it's just a little bit. Maybe you contact one person, you reach out, right? And now this is not so that you can be happy, right? This isn't force yourself to feel better. It's just interrupt the withdrawal with this one small action, right? And that's what we're looking at with all these different emotions. It's not pretend you don't feel this. It's make it just a little bit more workable so that you can still be sad, but it's not all encompassing. A simple example for me, recently I continue to have these anxiety spikes around recording new podcast episodes. Case in point, this episode that you're listening to right now, if I say, recently I was having anxiety about recording a podcast episode, recently literally means a few minutes ago, in case that, wasn't totally clear, right? And the urge behind that anxiety and that fear was to procrastinate, right? To avoid, to convince myself I wasn't ready yet. I need to prepare more. I need to think it through. I'll do it tomorrow. Push it. Super classic avoidance dressed up as prudence, right? So my opposite action was just start recording, even if it's bad, even if I delete it, even if I'm not ready, just take what notes I have masquerading as a script currently and just press record and go. And at first it felt absolutely awful. I could not get the intro in. I could not get myself rolling. My anxiety just kept on popping up and screaming, stop it. This is scary, right? My heart's racing. My thoughts are moving at 1,000 miles an hour. You're messing this up. This isn't good enough. You're not prepared. People are going to hear this and they're going to think you're terrible. Just cut it out. But I just kept doing it, kept going. Finally got the intro in and then kept rolling. And, we're 5-10 minutes in. We're 20 minutes in. Wow. And the anxiety has come down. It's not gone. I'm still constantly tripping myself up. It's not like I'm like suddenly calm and confident, but it went from, let's say, like a 9 to a 5, from this, like, I physically cannot do this to, okay, yeah, this is still uncomfortable, but I'm doing it anyway, right? And if you are listening to this now, that means I made it to the end and I managed to have some kind of usable recording. Probably not perfect, but done. Because the reality is the anxiety behind this was lying to me. Yes, it was trying to protect me from a threat that it thought it perceived, but that threat doesn't exist. And so it's something I think about often when I hear a statement like your anxiety is lying to you. It is, but it's not malicious. Don't hate your anxiety for it. It's doing its job. It's just that we've trained it to perceive the wrong threats. There's no real danger in recording this episode. Worst case scenario is that I record something I don't like and I delete it later, or I just put it out and move on to the next one. That's not a threat. That's just called trying, and opposite action proves that. It's showing my brain the thing that you're afraid of isn't actually dangerous. You can survive it. You can do it even if it feels scary. And the next time I have to record something, the anxiety is going to be there, but who knows? Dare to dream. Maybe it'll be an 8 when I start, and maybe after that it'll be a 7. And that's how it works, slowly and over time. Now, the thing is, I want to be honest about the times it doesn't work as well. I often am telling you stories of like, and it all worked out, you know? So I also want to tell you times where I know what the opposite action is, but I just can't. You know, it's moments when that sort of ingrained shame is so loud and the urge to hide is so present, and I know I should just reach out. I know reaching out will help. And I know that the isolation is just going to make things worse, but reaching out, you know, I described it as it feels like walking into a pit of fire, right? It feels like exposing myself to the exact same thing that I'm afraid of in that moment. Rejection, judgment, you know, confirmation that I was right to feel ashamed in the first place. And yes, there are moments where I can push through that and I can reach out. But sometimes it can't happen. Sometimes the emotion is too loud. Sometimes the stakes are just too high. And sometimes even knowing exactly what I should do, my body just refuses to cooperate. And I am continually learning that that is okay. Opposite action isn't about perfection. It's not about winning every single time. It's not about never letting the emotion win, right? You know, if anything, it's about not being in competition with your emotions, but that's a digression. It's about slowly building the muscle to act against unhelpful urges. Some days you have the ability to do the hard thing. Some days you don't. And both of those days are part of the same practice. Sometimes you do it, sometimes you don't. Either way, you are learning. Because, you know, even when I don't do the opposite action, even the times when I do hide and I know I should be doing whatever, I'm still building a level of awareness. I'm still noticing the pattern. I'm still seeing the choice, even if I can't make it in that moment, right? You know, awareness is half the battle, right? Isn't that what, you know, G.I. Joe said, you know, and now you know, and knowing is half the battle? That's some real solid advice right there. Probably the only piece of advice to take from those end of episode vignettes, but anyway. Problem solving. This is the skill you use when opposite action doesn't apply, when your emotion does fit the facts. You know, when there actually is a problem, fire alarm's going off because there actually is a fire. In that case, you do not do the opposite of the emotion. You address the actual problem. The way you do that is, put very simply, step one, you define the problem. Not the catastrophe, not the vague dread, the specific actual problem. Not, oh, my life is falling apart, but what specifically is having trouble right now? What's the one concrete thing that is wrong? So it's not, I'm failing at everything. It's, what specifically are you behind on? What is the task or the solution? Oh, didn't complete this. Oh, I need to work on that, right? Getting really specific. It takes the problem from being overwhelming to being workable. Step two is you break it down into pieces, as small as you need them to be. What are the absolutely smallest actionable steps? Not the full solution, not fix everything, but what are the actual component parts? So if it's a work deadline, what are the pieces of that deadline? What can you do today? What can you do tomorrow? What still needs doing? What incremental progress can you make? You know, is it, if it's relationship conflict, you know, what are the specific issues? What's one thing you can do or you can ask about right now? If it's, you know, let's say it's financial stress, you know, what is the one piece of the financial picture that you can break down and look at right now? So, you know, make it as small an actionable step as you need. If you need it to be, write a to-do list, and the first step is write that to-do list, you know, write first step, whatever. You break it down small, and celebrate everything, right? Step three is you then choose one step and you do that. You don't solve everything. You don't have to do it all in one go, in one moment, in one day. You just take it one single step at a time, because one step is always going to be enough. Progress at any speed is always better than stalling out with bigger bigger fears. For me, I recently had a big spiral out around money a couple weeks ago. I had just had this really big catastrophic vision in my head of, I'm going to run out of money. I'm going to be homeless. I'm going to lose everything. Just total financial collapse, ruin, apocalyptic, everything. Right. And then I actually just sat down and I broke it down and I made myself look at the actual pieces instead of the overwhelming feeling. And here's what I actually came up with was that, I needed to rework my budget and see where I actually was at financially. I needed to finish my taxes, which actually, luckily for me this year, were super easy. And I needed to just cut back on, a couple subscriptions to sort of free up a little bit of a cash flow. 3 action steps. That's it. No catastrophe, just 3 little things I can do. I did one, I looked at my budget, I sat down, I actually looked at the numbers instead of just avoiding them and kind of going on vibes. Then I did the next one. I imported all my tax forms into, Simple Tax or whatever it's called, and got that rolling. My financial problems still exist. They didn't disappear. I didn't suddenly find some windfall and, all my money problems were solved. I'm literally in the exact same position I was in before my meltdown, but it all just became manageable because now I wasn't in, I'm going to lose everything. Now it was, I have these specific tasks I can do. And hey, I've already done 2 of them. So, I'm doing great. And that right there's a difference between the catastrophe and the problem, right? Catastrophe feels impossible, but a problem has pieces and you can work with those pieces. Last skill of the week. And this one is a little bit different from almost everything we've covered so far. Because everything else in this module has been reactive, right? An emotion arrives, what do? Opposite action, problem solving, depending on the situation, whatever it is. Now we're looking at building positive experiences. And that is a proactive behavior. It's not crisis management. It's about building emotional reserves so that you are less vulnerable to crises in the first place. The idea is really simple. When your emotional life has positive experiences woven into it on a regular basis, your baseline is higher. You're not running on empty because you have something to draw on. So there's 2 sort of loose types, short-term, long-term, right? So short-term positives are just those little small joys, those daily pleasures, right? It's think of Agent Dale Cooper, right? Gonna let you know a little secret. Every day, once a day, treat yourself, right? The things that give you that moment of genuine ease or delight or comfort. It can be a cup of coffee, it can be a song that shifts your mood, just 5 minutes outside, texting somebody you love, petting your cat, a YouTube video that really makes you laugh, whatever. These don't need to be big. They don't even need to be meaningful. They just need to be genuinely positive for you. And, like we've talked about before, not the thing you think you should enjoy, the thing that you actually enjoy. And then the other side is long-term positive. So these are things that are building meaning over time. These can be creative projects, learning a skill, a community that you're a part of, a relationship that you're nurturing, work that matters to you. It's a goal that you are moving towards, no matter what pace, because these give you something to orient towards. They're something that makes the hard days feel like they're in service of something. And the reason that the skill is in emotional regulation is because positive experiences don't just feel good in the moment. They build resilience. They give your nervous system evidence that life does contain good things. And that evidence is going to matter enormously when hard things come. For me, some of the short-term positive things that I reach for on a kind of daily basis, I'll give you some examples. I go for a little walk around my neighborhood every day. I try to make a point to walk at least for a couple minutes. Sometimes it ends up being literally like 2 minutes around just my block. But, and I use this for really a variety of reasons, but I always make sure I go. And I cannot, off the top of my head, think of a time where even after a 2-minute walk, I've felt worse. It's almost always helped me feel a little bit better. Even when I don't want to, even when it's, when it's cold, it's rainy, and my brain is saying like, curl up, it's not going to help. I go, and yes, it does help. Another one for me is I let myself every day indulge in a little snack, chips or candy or whatever it is. And it might sound trivial. Sometimes it people hear snacks and like their own, I know a lot of people have relationships with food. I have my own relationship with food. So to me, it's actually really not trivial to let myself just like have this, because look, like I have been sober for, 2.5 years. I quit vaping almost 2 months ago. I don't do anything fun anymore. I'm allowed to have some nibs when I want them, right? And I admittedly used to feel kind of guilty about that. I've cut enough other things out that the candy stays. And it lets me have a little bit of a shortcut. If I need a quick little pick me up, have some candy, whatever, who cares, Long-term positives are for me has always been and will continue to be having creative projects, right? Currently I'm working on both a collection of essays and a novel that I kind of flip between depending on what my brain wants that day. I've also started challenging myself to new forms of writing. I just got into trying out songwriting, which is terrifying and kind of humiliating, but really gratifying. And then, of course, like this podcast is a perfect example. I've got the collaboration with Book Warehouse that's building and all the live recordings, and that's just been such an incredible positive experience. The way that this show has kind of morphed and adapted along the way with all the shifts in my life has really made it into this kind of constant kind of support buoy for me. It's something that I continue to rely on for expression, for connection, for processing. And do all of these things help? Mostly. Yeah. You got to remember, no one thing is the cure-all. Nothing truly wipes the slate clean. A walk doesn't fix everything. Writing a song isn't going to erase the hard stuff, but taken collectively and incrementally, they all add up to helping. They give me something to reach for when things are hard. They give me evidence that life contains things worth showing up for. And that is what makes the difference. Okay. Quick practice. We're going to do a little decision tree. Think of one emotion you are carrying right now. Maybe something from today, maybe something ongoing. Name it specifically. Now, does this emotion fit the actual facts, or is it responding to a story? If it doesn't fit the facts, or if acting on the urge is going to harm your goals, what's the opposite action? What does the emotion want to do? And what's the opposite of that? If it does fit the facts, and there's something you can do, what's the actual problem? And what is the smallest first step you can take? You don't have to do anything right now. Just notice where you land in the decision tree. Now, one reflection question for you. What is one positive experience, short-term or long-term, that you can intentionally add to your life? Not a big thing, something doable. Something that would give your nervous system even just a small deposit of that life contains good things currency. Because you're going to need that reserve. Hard moments come, and it is a lot easier to navigate them when you're not running on empty. So that is emotional regulation part 2. We looked at opposite action for when the emotion is real, but the urge would make things worse. You do the opposite, fully with commitment. We looked at problem solving for when the emotions fit the facts and there's actually something you can do. You break it down, you take one step. And then we looked at build positive experiences. Don't wait until you're in crisis to start. Build the reserves. So that's 3 full modules down. We looked at mindfulness and emotional regulation, so we kind of understand the landscape. We also covered distress tolerance. So we have our crisis survival tools. Of course, through it all, same through line. You're not broken. Your emotions make sense. The patterns make sense. And there are tools that can help you navigate them. Next up, final module, interpersonal effectiveness, which is about one of the messiest parts of being a human, interacting with other humans. So we're going to ask things like, how do you ask for what you need without either people pleasing or accidentally burning the relationship down? How do you set limits and still feel like yourself afterwards? How do you stay in relationships that matter to you without losing who you are in the process? So that's going to be the next couple episodes. And I've been thinking, honestly, for a podcast called Friendless, these next ones feel pretty appropriate. But that is coming up, and I hope I will catch you there. But as always, I'm not going to worry about that right now, and neither should you, because that is then, and this is now. So for now, I will just say I love you, and I wish you well. Fun and safety, sweet peas.